Lamentations. And I want to just kind of go back because I think of all the 5 books we're looking at, this is the one that's the most challenging for Americans. We don't do grief well. We don't like it. We don't stay with it. We want to move from grief to better far too quickly. And Lamentations, and remember, it's an acrostic fashion, going for the first letter of the alphabet, and the Hebrew alphabet, to the last letter of the Hebrew alphabet, and then goes right back, chapter 2, to begin again at the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet, walking all the way through the last letter of the Hebrew alphabet. And it really kind of gives structure and organization to our grief, that we go through our grief, that we spend time in it, that we give it the time that it deserves. I have a friend who believes that most people see the world through prisms of unshed tears. I think one of the main transition problems Americans have is not that we're not willing to jump into new things, and I've shared this with you before, not that we're not willing to jump into the new reality of life, but that we're not willing to grieve, lament, and let go of the old reality. And you'll see that with people. The biggest challenge in transition is not entering into something new, but it's grieving and letting go of something old. We do not do grief very well. And there's something about the power of Lamentations that makes us stand in the grief, sit in the grief, examine the grief, organize the grief, walk through the grief. And most of us in our culture, we just don't want to do that. And we don't have the traditions and structures to help us do that. The other power of lamentation is that there is an end to lamentation. There is a time for grief, and there's a time to move on. And I think we try to diminish in our culture, I think we diminish the time for grief, and we try to move on far too early. And I think because of that, we end up limping through the further on. And I think because of that, our grief period extends because we're unwilling to look at it. And it begins, and it can begin to control us. That's the idea that we see the world through the prism of unshed tears. So I want to know, just in your group, did you get any discussion, or do you have any ways? How do you stay in grief? There's nothing fun about it. There's nothing that we want to stay in it. How do you organize grief? How do you stay in grief? How do you walk through grief? How do you do something when you don't want to do it? Are there any help that you guys have in terms of, in your small groups or just in your own life, ways that you stick with your grief and not run too quickly? Sharon? Quilt. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's and something that takes a long time and has a lot of time associated to it. When you can attach grieving to something, then when you're doing that, it becomes that act, it becomes that acrostic of grief, of working through it. That's a great idea. Looking at old photos. That's something that we'd want to avoid, right? Often you'll find in houses, people, they'll take the pictures and put them away. They'll take the videos and put them away. And so just forcing ourselves to sit down and look at the pictures and remember and to walk through that. There's a sense that we're like, I don't want to have that around because I don't want to be reminded of these things that are sad. But there's an actual incredible importance. Remember, we started last week talking about this incredible movie, Inside Out, where the hero of the movie is sadness. Such a powerful message in our culture where we don't want sadness to play a part at all. And we are very diminished people when we don't allow sadness to play a key part in our life. Are there any other things that you do that help you to work the acrostic of grief? Sharing stories, yeah. That's really, really important. Music does, yeah. Exactly, creating music, playing music, but singing music, even listening to music. There are some, and music, as you know, there are 2 senses that will connect straight back to our memories and almost bypass our cerebellum. Your olfactory senses are one, but you can't always organize those. But music will take you to emotions and places before your cerebellum even realizes that you've gone there. But listening is powerful.
I think just crying, getting it out, just crying, and then it's over.
Crying is incredibly important. No, I mean, and in the book that I passed out, that I have no more to pass out, you cleaned out my stash of Tear Soup. Nothing wrong with that at all. I'm thrilled. I've already bought new books. They're just not here yet. But in Tear Soup, it's all about how do you make tear soup. And if you get to read the book, what happens is this woman begins to make tear soup, and that's a metaphor for grief, for crying, for going through the acrostic of grief. And people come and say, well, let me do that for you. And people come and say, you're doing it wrong. Or people come and say, well, let me show you how to do it. And the best friend is the one who comes and says, let me bake some bread. Let me bake some bread to go with your tear soup. You got to make sure that you've got some good friends in grief, because we live in a world that will say you're doing it too much. You've got to snap out of this. You got to move through this. We need to have those friends who allow us to give the grief the time that it deserves. But remember, the second thing we said as we looked at the structure of Lamentations is not only does it organize our grief, not only does it force us to go through, not only does it say that there's something to be gained from repetition. There's something to be gained from going back through again and going back through again. And there, as we get into, if we really work the grief well, we will find that there becomes something repetitive about the grief. There's also a communal element of the lament. That lament is communal. The lament is communal. In our culture, we tend to grieve in isolation. And I actually believe nothing could be more dangerous. There's something about humans, and I will acknowledge that men do this far more than women. But when we start to hurt, when we start to struggle, when things get difficult, we tend to isolate, which is the worst thing we could do. Because lament, communal lament, gives meaning to our grief. It moves something that tears us down into something that builds us up. Communal lament allows us to find meaning in our grief. Communal lament is the way I believe that we were created to grieve. And yet, when we start to hurt, remember I shared the great American poem, when you laugh, the world laughs with you. When you cry alone. And we tend to isolate. And I'm convinced that bad things happen when we isolate. When we isolate, we tend to live more in darkness. We tend to, and at that time, then the things that gain control in our life are darkness and shame. And they tend to bring control. And there's something about lamenting in a communal way that allows those things to come to light and allows them to be transformed. In our own lives, the grief that we have gone through has been the sickness and cancer and death of our son. That is a societally acceptable grief. And so in some ways, we've had it easy when it comes to grief because we should be grieving the death of a child. There are many griefs that are much quieter, and they come with an element of shame with them. Some of the griefs that people carry are trauma. Some of the griefs that people carry are sexual abuse. Some of the griefs that people carry might be children that are off in jail. Some of these griefs are things that when you bring them out, they're not always societally acceptable. There's not always a group of people who are like, let's stand together and wrestle with you in some of these things. Sometimes it's suicide. Sometimes it's trauma. There are harder places, and there are places that come with this element of shame. I want to commend, if that's something that intrigues you, a book that has really caught my ear for the last year is a book by Brene Brown, and it's called Daring Greatly. And Brene Brown is a psychologist and a social researcher. She has discovered, in her research, she's discovered that shame is the thing that stops people from living what she calls wholeheartedly. I think I shared last year a list of the 10 things that a wholehearted person does, which are basically a list of what kingdom values are. This is how followers of Jesus live. Wholehearted people live in play, they live in joy, they live in not in anxiety. There's all these different elements of what it means to live wholeheartedly. She says the biggest thing that stops us is shame. In her study, she's discovered that the best way to deal with shame is the worst news she could possibly receive. That the best way to deal with shame is by being vulnerable. and sharing openly with other people, it's really fun to read because she just does it in a very funny way. She's like, this is horrible news for someone like me. This is not what I wanted to discover. There's something about bringing it out communally and openly that allows us to process, to lament together. So I would ask, and as we do that, I think there's something powerful. We have seen this at Camp Side by Side. Lori and our family has worked for 10 years at Camp Side by Side. It's a camp of families that have a child with cancer. And it's 20 families, and they all have a child that's battling cancer at some point in the journey. And as we gather together, these parents are able to talk with other parents who are facing the same challenges. And there's a way that they can minister to each other in a very powerful way that possibly parents who don't understand what it's like to have a child that's sick with cancer could not. The Compassionate Friends is a ministry for those parents who have lost children. And it was by a pastor, an Episcopalian pastor, who got two couples in his church together, both of whom had lost children, and realized that they were able to minister to each other in ways that he was never going to be able to minister to them. So how do you gather? There is power in finding other people who are dealing with the similar grief that you are. There are contexts and edges, and there's something about grief that you want to talk with other people who have grieved, but to talk with other people who are going through similar grief, when you've lost a parent, you could talk to someone who has a parent. When you've got a person in your family who's battling alcoholism, you can talk with someone else who's battling. There's a power in gathering with people who can name the same sort of challenge that they have. I would ask the question, how do you make grief communal? What are ways that you can have done, or what are ways that you have seen others do that you think help to make your grief, to help to bring the grief into light, to bring the grief into community so that you're not facing it in isolation? Do you guys have any ideas or ways things that you have seen that have helped to do that? What?
Prayer with people.
Prayer with people. Just having a place where you have that, and you want to have a group that you trust, a group that you know is confidential and loving and supportive, and that's a place where you can, when you've built that trust, you can open up and be vulnerable in an appropriate manner about here are some of the grief. It's not always helpful to vomit grief on everyone we meet. It's helpful to make sure that you've got that place of trust and vulnerability and mutuality where you can have that sort of prayer and that sort of openness. I think that's wonderful. What else?
Gathered together. We did once a month for a dinner together. Everybody could talk and share.
Something powerful that happens over food. I'm a big believer in sitting at a table. Or, as Alyssa said, in your backyard. There's just, if there's food involved and you're sitting around, there's something very important that happens there. Other ways that you have found making your grief communal. Janelle.
This is one of those griefs that's not as socially acceptable, but I have a family member who's an addict, and going to Al-Anon, the family support group for that, was incredible because there's only so many times that you can talk to your family about what you're going through, and people don't get it unless they have experienced it.
Yeah.
And so to just be in a group where, like you were talking about, Doug, where they understood was so powerful.
Yeah.
Just incredibly powerful.
And it's very scary. The first time you go to one of those groups, it's terrifying. And yet, it can be so powerful when you realize that you're not alone in this grief, that there are others who are walking this road and are willing to walk with you.
And the great thing is people that try and cheer you up or say things would get better.
Yeah.
You just sat with you.
Yeah. No, it's very, very powerful. People who just sit with the grief and understand it. Here's the good news, and I was going to get to this a little bit later, but all of us want to also be able to sit with people who are grieving. One of the things I hear most often are people saying, I just don't know what to say to make it better. Let me free you up from that. You cannot make it better. You don't have to. Don't try. In fact, the best thing you can do, you've heard me say this before, show up and shut up. There is a higher propensity that you will cause harm by the words that you say. It is better to show up and shut up, to be there, to just listen, to just say, I'm with you, I'm walking with you. and to carry some of the grief. Sometimes there's grief that is just appropriate for people to bear on their own. But sometimes we get to grief that is more than we can bear on our own, and it's so helpful to know that there are people who just like, I'm carrying your grief. I am very, very sad. One of the things that was amazing for us is some of our good friends, when Zachary first had cancer, was first diagnosed, they didn't go to work for 2 days because they were so bowed down. They were holding the grief so heavy that they couldn't go to work. And it was so wonderful to know we're not walking through this alone. There's others who are carrying this grief with us. Very, very powerful. Anything else that helps make it communal? Because this, in our society, this is what blocks us, I think, from making that communal lament. And this is what robs us from being able to take what is tearing us down, but God can use to build us up. When we can bring it into a communal grief, when we can bring it into a communal lament, when we can allow people to walk with us, and God can then use that grief in a way that's incredibly powerful. Jean.
This isn't that. This is the other side of it. What if your grief is showing up on the evening news?
Yeah, that's one of the, and we're seeing some of that right now for those of us who follow college football. We're watching the old coach from Washington, his life just fall apart in a very public way, and that's a big deal. And that only happens to the major celebrities in our world who walk that. But there's a challenge. There is a challenge to your grief being publicly carried by this whole group, and often things that appear in the news are not out there for the love and encouragement of the American body. They tend to be out there just for the sensationalism and the titillating of we want to see other people crash and burn because it makes us feel better. So there's a danger to that. So for those of you who are high-end celebrities.
Well, it's not even just celebrities. It could be, there's, your house is just burned down and somebody's there with the microphone.
Yeah.
How do you feel?
Yeah, and there's a sense of communal lament. Doesn't mean, as I said, it doesn't mean that you vomit it out your grief on everyone, or that it's appropriate to share it on Facebook. Communal lament is that there's a place that you have, that you know and are known, and there's a place that you're able to put to word and put into song and put into poetry or whatever it is, to put your grief out in a way that is safe and appropriate. I think you're right. The things that become really public are often not appropriate. And that's a danger. Carrie.
And yet, and you mentioned this last week, Carrie Bridge or your blog or something like that can be a wonderful way.
It can be an incredible way to do that. And yet there are some of those that are totally public, and there are some of those that are very closed. Having an appropriate place. The internet is a gift and a hindrance. It's just something, it's a tool that can be used for good and can be used for evil in all those ways.
Yeah, and I read in guideposts that you have to watch out for, like, when you do hearing bridge and things like that it actually attracts like the mentally ill that prey
Yeah.
on people.
No, there's
So you have to watch out for that.
No, there's no question. It's all in this. There's a negative, and yet there is something about writing it and having a place where people can read along with you. There's a book that I'm reading now. This pastor who is down in Seattle, and he has just recently passed away. And the book that he wrote is just the last year of his life and his carrying bridge. And so it's just Steve Hayner and his wife Cheryl Hayner. And this book is stunning. It's just beautiful, just to hear this very wise man face the last year of his life and talk about calling and life and love and abundance and joy. Incredible book. So there's something, Frederick Buechner says we're called to be stewards of our pain. And there's a way that when we do this well, when we steward our pain well, it becomes a gift to other people.
I was just going to say, it seems like you need to be willing to sometimes sitting and doing nothing, the way to go, of course, but
Yeah.
sometimes just accepting help, I think, is crucial because that's how you build community and
Absolutely. And if there's anything that goes against the basic American personality, it is accepting help. And if there is the gift of grief, It's that we finally get to the place that we can't do it on our own. And most of us have never even gotten there. And getting forced to the place where we have to receive help because we can't do it on our own is the way we were created to live. But we live in a very crazy society that believes that strength is doing it on your own and not receiving help from anyone, which blocks us from receiving grace. It blocks us from relationship with God. It blocks us from a lot. And so we live in a place where individualism and self-resiliency have become idols. Now, that doesn't mean that individualism and resiliency are not good. They're actually very good, but we live in a place where we are in an extreme, and it blocks us from being able to receive help from others and to being able to receive help from God. And both those things, grief is one of those things that pushes us down, and we are no longer able to go on our own. And there's a blessing in that, and we hate every minute of it because it goes it goes against what we hold on to. Make it communal. And maybe in your small groups you can talk about what are ways that you do this. How do we break the cycle of shame which keeps us isolated and not receiving help? I mean, there's a shame in receiving help. We live in a culture that it's shameful to receive help, as messed up as that is. How do we break that cycle and allow through vulnerability, allow God to enter into that? And then the other thing we talked about is that the Lamentation holds on to the reality of grief. I mean, Lamentations is more real about grief than any book in the Bible, than any section of the Bible. And yet it is also holds on more tightly to the love of God than any section in the Bible. How do we hold on with both hands? When you do that, you're doing real theology. When you do that, you are doing very difficult theology. There are no easy answers once you enter into that. This is called the theodicy problem. Theos for God, DC for actually judge. Theodicy is when we put God on trial and judge God. Theodicy is how do we make sense that God is all loving, that God is all powerful, and that suffering exists in the world. This was not a problem until about 150 years ago. Before that, people would just go, well, of course, suffering exists. It was not, but we live in a world now that we think, well, if God's all loving and God's all powerful, he doesn't want us to suffer. Maybe not. How do we make sense of a God who's all loving, all powerful, and suffering? There's lots of, you don't need to go through this alone. There are many thinkers who have gone ahead of you. Stick to the ones, if I can encourage you, stick to the ones that hold tight to those three things. What many people are tempted to do is to lower, think of it as a three-legged stool. People are tempted to lower one of the legs. God is either not all loving. God's all powerful, but he really doesn't care. Or God is all loving, but he's really not that powerful. But hold on to God is all loving. God is all powerful. That's what we read in Scripture. And hold on to that suffering exists. Some people try to explain it and say, well, it's not really suffering. You just feel it as suffering, but it's not really suffering. I wonder about those people. Don't lower any of the three stools, any of the three legs, but hold on to those three realities. And there are answers. None of them are terribly satisfying, but there are lots of ways to think about it. But when you deal with that, you're saying, how do I hold on to the reality of this grief and this pain and this suffering and the reality of the grace and the love and the goodness of God? How do I hold on to both of those and live in the tension of that? Real theology is living in tension. Real theology is you don't ever get to wrap it up in a little bow and say, well, there it is. Real theology, you live in the tension of real grief, real suffering, real grace, real love. I encourage you to look at that. We said last time that this Lamentations is read every year at the 9th of Av. 9th of Av is a commemoration of the destruction of the two temples in the history of Judaism. It's also been added onto that all of the different sufferings and grief that different Jewish communities have had. So the 9th of Av is a day of fasting. It's a day of grieving. It's a day of pain. It's a day that's set aside just to grieve and to hold on to the reality of that. I said last time that I would share with you some of the traditions that Jewish people use, and I think it's very interesting. The first part, in the face of a loss, the beginning part of a Jewish grief in the face of a loss, usually of a death, is called annuit, and it's the burial. Right away, the first thing that happens within 24 hours is a person who's died is buried. This obviously comes from long history of before embalming or anything like that. It was in refrigeration. It was important to get people buried right away. So the beginning is just the first 24 hours are that the family is left alone at that moment. People don't come to their house. People don't. The family is left to their own, and the family is exempt from the thou shalt commandments in the Bible. They're not exempt from the thou shalt not, but they're exempt from the thou shalt commandments during that period of time when the burial is going on. And the next 7 days are known as sitting Shiva. And a Jewish family at that point will come home and they will sit low. They will sit low. They will darken all the mirrors. They will often darken all the house. They will not shave. They will not take care of any type of regular daily ablutions. And people will just bring food and sit with them. And people will just bring food and feed them and come check in and walk in. And the community rallies around after this burial time, rallies around and just comes to feed them and to talk with them. And they spend these 7 days usually sitting low on the ground, not shaving, not doing their hair, not doing anything, and just grieving, just being sad for 7 days. After that, there's something called shloshim. I'm sure I'm just butchering the pronunciations. But it's from 7 days to 30 days, and it continues on that. There's no parties. They don't go to parties. There's no shaving. During that time, there are rules for going to the synagogue. The first 2 weeks, you don't go to the synagogue. The next week, you just stand outside the synagogue. The next week, you go, but you come late and you leave early. So you're not there for the coffee hour portion of synagogue. You arrive and you participate, but you pull yourself out of the social element. So it's kind of nice in these traditions that you don't need to think about what do I do. It's just laid out for you. Here are the things that you do. If it is a parent who has died, there's also one other portion where you don't go to parties for the next year. And we used to have traditions in our church, in our areas of wearing black, but people would mark on their bodies, I'm in grief. I've been to a few Jewish services, Sabbath services, and there's actually a time that they say, who is in one of these grief periods? And people will stand and then they'll pray for them. There's just an acknowledgement. You're in a grief season. We acknowledge that. How do we as a community walk alongside that? There's something very, very healthy in that. I also think when we look at our Middle Eastern brothers and sisters, there's something about the expressiveness. There's screaming, there's yelling, there's this very vocal. We come from different people. We think about stiff upper lips. We think about the proper way to go about a memorial service is not to cry, not to show emotion, but to keep that stiff upper lip. And I wonder whether that's not the best thing for us. Maybe you're not going to do it at the memorial service, but find a place where you can scream and cry. Find a place where you can give vent to your emotions. Find a place where you can break things. Find a place where you can fully just scream out. Do it far away enough that people don't call the police. Do it. Find some place that's maybe more isolated. But we need to have places where we can give vent to that. I have spoken way too long. I apologize for that. I just want to share 3 experiences that I've had with grief that I hope will be helpful. One, about 3 years after Zach had died, I was in Israel and going to Bethlehem. Many of you know that Zachary died on December 24th. So to me, Bethlehem was kind of a connected experience. And so I was reading through the passage in Matthew, just getting ready to get on a bus. And going to Bethlehem is a very difficult thing. You have to leave Israel territory. You have to get a different guide. It's hard, it's painful, it's dirty, it's a lot more beggars. It's an in-your-face, just, and you have to go through the wall, it just feels yucky, the whole thing. But I was reading and Matthew quotes a Jeremiah passage. Remember, Jeremiah is the author of Lamentations. But he quotes a Jeremiah passage saying, a voice in Ramah, weeping, Rachel weeping for her children because they are no more, refusing to be comforted. And to me, it just kind of clicked into something. In the midst of our grief, we don't want to be there, and yet we don't really want to be comforted. There's something about grief that connects us to the loss that we've had. And so we live in that tension And it just became true in that Jeremiah passage, refusing to be comforted because they are no more. And that just kind of struck me. That's kind of the challenge of the grief that we live in. We don't want to be comforted, and yet we don't want to be in grief. And so we're stuck in between that. There's an element that we're weeping for our children because they are no more. And that just, there's something that spoke very powerfully to me in that scripture. That was a very, very helpful thing. And for me, as we talk about, as we talk about Lamentations, this is a community that's gone into exile. Exile for me was a very powerful image. In exile, you're taken from your home into a new place, and you have to live in that new place for the rest of your life. To me, that's what grief felt like. Grief was entering into a new culture, a new world. You're in this new world. You can't go back to the old world. You can never make it back. You're in this new world, so put down roots, figure out where the dry cleaning is, and start making a life in this new world. You didn't choose to be here. You don't want to be here. You didn't move here by choice. Okay, but you're here, and you can't go back. So get used to it. And there was something about exile that it was like this grief to us was an exile. We went to a world where Zachary was no longer a part of our world. Nothing we can do about it. We didn't do it by our choice. We didn't do it by desire. It was done. And so we had to make a life in this new world. And what did that look like? And that wasn't any way of not respecting him. That was just what life is. And so exile became a very important image for me as we went through. And then lastly, I would just share, I've shared this story many times before, but when Zachary was first diagnosed with cancer, we had been in the hospital for 5 days. We were wearing the same clothes. It was gross. It wasn't what we cared about. We were sitting Shiva. It was not a concern to us, but I was like, I'm going to go get some new clothes because we'll stand each other a little bit better. So I was driving away from the hospital and he had just been born, and so everything in the world was about breastfeeding. And we were either getting ready to breastfeed, Lori was getting ready to breastfeed and I was helping, or she was breastfeeding, or we were cleaning up from breastfeeding. And when we were done with that, then we were getting ready. It just felt like the whole thing was dominated by breastfeeding. And I'm driving down 85th, going to our house, and I just had this incredible, one of these very clear visions from God, where Isaiah 49, just whether it was a vocal voice or not, just came into my mind. Even though the woman may forget the child at her breast. And for those of you who are breastfeeding, here's the good news. Psychological experiments have shown that your memory is deeply, deeply troubled. You have trouble remembering things. You struggle to remember things. It is taking you twice as much energy to feed this child than it did to make them. That's what God does to help kind of lose that pregnancy weight. You are spending so much energy feeding this child that very little is going to your brain. But this wonderful sense, a woman might forget the child at her breast, but I will not forget you, says the Lord. In the midst of our grief, we always feel most forgotten, but it's when we are most remembered. I'm going to be gone for 2 weeks. In 3 weeks, we're going to look at Ecclesiastes. We've already looked at Ecclesiastes together a few years ago in this group. Many of you didn't like it. It's a great book. It's a book all about meaning. What is meaningful in the world? It is a book for our generation. It's a book for millennials. It's a book for our grandchildren. It is an important book about how do we find meaning in life. And yet it is a confusing book. It's a meandering book. There is nothing linear about Ecclesiastes. Ecclesiastes was written by a P, not a J, for those of you who know Myers-Briggs. If you're a J, you're going to really dislike this book. Get over it. This is not linear. It's going to be like, okay, point number 3, now point number 1, now point number 5. And you're going to look and say, you can't do that. If you have point number 5, it needs to come after point number 4. Not according to Ecclesiastes. It's just like, it's going to meander all over the world, saying one thing and then saying the opposite thing, and you're going to be pulling your hair out. Just sit with it. This is a book that says, where do we find meaning? And it says, and it concludes at the very end, the only place to find meaning. Nothing in the world is meaningful other than a relationship with God. It's an amazing, amazing book. We're going to look at that in 3 weeks. Sit with your groups and just talk about what helps you to grieve. What helps you to sit with grief? What helps you to make grief communal? Are there traditions that you would bring about to help us as a culture be healthier in our grief? And who in your world is grieving? And what would it look like for you to be a good tear soup friend. Let me pray for us. Lord, thank you for the time you've given us. Thank you for the pain you've given us, and that as we steward our pain, we can actually use it to bring blessing and grief to those around us. In your name we pray. Amen.